the barriers and complications for deaf students in mainstream education. So at the top here we have listed the lack of general knowledge regarding deaf persons. I listed this as a complication because oftentimes, again, only 1.3% of college students were deaf. This means that not very many people are exposed to deaf people, and when they are, they're curious and they don't have that general knowledge, so they start asking rather personal questions, such as, how did you lose your hearing? Often posed as, what happened to you? Second, show me your hearing aids. That's definitely a top contender of things said to me when I tell people I'm deaf. And they just ask personal questions that, deaf people might feel obligated to answer because we realize that we're not common and that the people probably just don't have any other exposure. But nonetheless, it creates an uncomfortable environment for those deaf students. And it's something that could be avoided if perhaps there was a more widespread knowledge about deaf life and deaf culture and what it means to be deaf. Moving on to the second bubble there, being the odd one out. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Being the odd one out can obviously make any student feel uncomfortable, but when you're deaf or hard of hearing and a student and you're the odd one out, it might make you less willing to ask for those accommodations, which will hinder your education if you're not comfortable asking for those accommodations or sitting at the front of the class, making sure the teacher is facing you. If you're not feeling comfortable in your little classroom society, there's a good chance that you might not ask for those things. Another thing that might stem from being the odd one out here is trying to hide your hearing aids, doing all you can to kind of just suppress the fact that you have a disability. Again, leads to an uncomfortable environment for the deaf student. It creates a student that's always on edge, very stressed out, very frustrated because they're trying to focus on so many different things at once to try to pass, quote unquote, as hearing. It's definitely a complication and a barrier for students in mainstream educations when they are deaf. Last but not least on here is communication barriers. So if a student feels most comfortable communicating in ASL and they're in a mainstream education setting, it's obviously going to come up that they are not fluently communicating with their peers if those peers are not previously exposed to ASL or deaf students. Hopefully in that scenario, the student would be placed in a bit better of an LRE where it has a more upfront access to the ASL, and maybe they'd be around other students that use ASL as well, because in a mainstream education setting, it's not going to be common for the other students or even the primary teacher to be using ASL, I would say. And that's definitely a communication barrier in the life of a deaf student.